The night August Rhodes rode into Calico Flats, the sky to the east was already burning orange, and it took him a full minute of squinting through the darkness to realize the light wasn't the sun coming up wrong. It was a barn. Someone's barn, set back off the main trail maybe a quarter mile, flames licking up the eastern wall and curling into the black October sky like the fingers of something hungry and enormous. August pulled his horse, a broad-chested roan he'd been calling Gideon since he won the animal in a card game outside of Abilene, to a stop in the middle of the rutted dirt road and sat there watching. He was good at watching. He'd spent the better part of 3 years doing exactly that, moving from one dusty town to the next across the territory, watching other people's lives the way you watch a river from a bridge, curious but uninvolved. But there was a figure running from the farmhouse toward that burning barn, and even in the dark and even at that distance, August could see it was a woman, and she was running toward the fire, not away from it. He turned Gideon off the road without making a conscious decision to do so. Lucy Townsend had been asleep for exactly 40 minutes when the smell woke her. Not the smell of smoke at first, not precisely, but something older and more animal than that. The smell of something wrong in the night, the way livestock sometimes went still before a storm. She sat up in the dark of the farmhouse bedroom she'd slept in alone for going on 14 months and breathed in, and then she was up and running before her feet had time to find her boots. She grabbed them anyway, carried them in one hand as she threw open the back door and saw it. The eastern wall of the barn was gone to fire, the whole lower section blazing, the light so fierce it hurt to look at directly, and from inside she could hear the horses screaming. She had 2 horses. A plow mare named Dolars, and a young gelding she'd gotten from a man passing through in August who'd sold him cheap, because the animal had a cracked front hoof that had since healed up mostly fine. She'd named him Pepper on account of his coloring, and she'd grown fond of him in the way lonely people grow fond of things quickly. She ran barefoot across the frozen November ground toward the barn door, the heat of the fire hitting her like a wall 30 feet before she reached the building, and she was reaching for the latch when a hand caught her arm from behind and spun her around so hard she nearly fell. "Don't." The voice was low and urgent, and belonged to a man she had never seen before in her life. Lucy Townsend was not a woman who frightened easily. She'd buried her husband 14 months ago in the red earth south of the house. She'd run this farm alone through a summer that nearly broke her and a harvest that didn't. She'd faced down Elias Prout from the bank twice when he came sniffing around her deed, and she'd done it with a rifle across her forearms both times. She was 26 years old and she did not frighten easily, but she was frightened now and not of the fire. "Let go of me," she said, her voice coming out harder than she felt. "My horses are in there." "The latch side wall is about to go," the man said, and he didn't let go. "You go in there and you won't come out." He was tall, maybe 6 feet in some, with a jaw dark with several days of travel and eyes that caught the firelight and held it. "Tell me where they're stalled." "Left side, first and second stall." He let go of her arm and went toward the barn at a run, and Lucy stood there for 3 full seconds with her boots still in her hand before she followed him. He was faster than her, and he hit the barn door with his shoulder while she was still 20 feet back, and the door swung open, and a wave of heat and smoke came out like a living thing. She heard him coughing, heard him moving, heard the frantic sound of the horses over the crackle and spit of the fire, and then she was at the door herself, and the smoke was so thick she had to drop low. He had Dolars already, had the rope halter on her and was pulling the mare toward the door. The mare was wide-eyed and shaking, fighting the halter, but the man was talking to her in a low, continuous stream of words Lucy couldn't make out, and the mare was moving, reluctantly, toward the door. Lucy went for Pepper. The gelding had his back to her, pressed into the corner of his stall, trembling so hard she could feel it through the stall boards. She talked to him the way she always talked to him, saying his name, telling him things were going to be all right in a voice that didn't entirely believe it. And she got the stall door open and got her arm around his neck and walked him out. They came out of the barn together, Lucy and the stranger, each of them leading a horse, into the cold November air. And behind them the eastern wall came down with a sound like the end of something, and sent up a pillar of sparks that scattered across the yard like thrown seeds. Lucy stood in the cold with Pepper's neck under her arm, the gelding still shaking, her own chest heaving from the smoke, and she looked at the man who had come out of nowhere and gone into her burning barn without knowing a single thing about her or her horses or her life, and she didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she said, because it was true and because it was the only thing there was. He was breathing hard. He nodded at her, his eyes moving from her to the barn, which was going fast now, the roof catching, the whole structure settling into itself with deep wooden groans. "You got somewhere to keep them tonight, somewhere away from the sparks." "The feed shed," she said, "back of the house." They walked the horses together in the dark, Lucy leading Pepper and the stranger leading Dolors, the barn's light throwing long uneven shadows across the yard. They got the horses into the feed shed, and Lucy got the door latched and turned around, and the stranger was tying his own horse, a big roan, to the fence rail alongside the shed. "Your horse," she said. He was getting nervous out front. He pulled the cinch loose and loosened the saddle but left it on. His movements were efficient and unhurried, the movements of a man accustomed to doing things without an audience. Lucy looked at him in the light that spilled from the burning barn, which was putting out enough glow to see by, and she noticed he was younger than she'd first thought. Not a boy, certainly, but not a weathered old trail hand either. He might have been 29 or 30, lean in the way that comes from years of moving rather than from youth, with dark hair pressed flat from his hat, which was sitting crooked from the run. His coat was a heavy canvas duster with a collar turned up, and it smelled of horses and road dust and now smoke. "August Rhodes," he said, as if he'd noticed her looking and decided to give her something useful. "Lucy Townsend." She looked back at the barn. The roof was fully engaged now, and there would be nothing left to save. "You just riding through. That's the shape of it." "Well, August Rhodes," she said, "you saved my horses. I don't have much, but I have a warm fire inside and a pot of something on the stove from supper." He looked at the burning barn. He looked at her. He had a way of looking at things that was very still, not cold exactly, but contained, like a man who'd learned not to let things show until he'd decided what he thought about them. "I won't say no to that," he said. The farmhouse was small but solid, built from lumber and sweat by a man named Thomas Townsend, who had come out from Missouri in 1877 with his young wife, and a determination that had been larger than his practical skills, but not by so much that he hadn't made something of it. The parlor had a stone fireplace, a good fire going still from the evening, a narrow settee, a rocker, and a side table covered in the accumulated papers of running a small farm alone. A hand-drawn map of the property was tacked above the fireplace. The kitchen was through a door at the back, and it smelled of the beef and root vegetable stew that had been Lucy's supper and would now be this stranger's supper too. August Rhodes sat at her kitchen table and ate 2 bowls of the stew and drank the coffee she made without talking much, and Lucy sat across from him and watched the way a person watches someone who has done them an enormous kindness and whose motives they cannot quite locate. She had learned to be careful with strangers. The territory in 1881 was full of men in motion, and not all of them were in motion for good reasons. But this man had gone into her burning barn for her horses without being asked and without any calculation she could see, and that counted for something. "Where are you coming from?" she asked when the second bowl was mostly gone. "Dodge City, most recently." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Before that, up around the Republican River country." "Where are you headed?" He looked at the table for a moment, the way a man looks at a question he's heard before and doesn't have a satisfying answer to. "South, generally, maybe New Mexico territory." "You got people down there?" "No." Lucy understood that kind of no. It was a closing off no, not unkind but firm. She'd said the same kind of no to plenty of questions over the past 14 months. When people asked about Thomas, when they asked how she was managing, when they used a gentle voice that contained the expectation that she would eventually sell the farm and move somewhere smaller and more appropriate for a widow woman. "There's a hayloft above the feed shed," she said. "It's drafty, but there's plenty of hay and it'll be warmer than out in the open. You're welcome to stay the night. I expect in the morning we'll be able to see what's left of the barn." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that was briefly unguarded, something that looked almost like relief, though he covered it quickly. "That's kind of you. I'll take you up on it." She got him a blanket from the cedar chest in the hall, thick wool, and he thanked her and went out into the November dark. And Lucy stood in the kitchen listening to the distant hiss and crack of the barn burning itself down to nothing and thought about how strange it was, the things that arrived in a person's life without warning. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and thought about the fire, about how it had started. The lantern in the barn was kept properly hung and the wick kept trimmed. She thought about what she'd seen in the barn before the smoke got too thick. The fire had started at the base of the eastern wall, not near the lantern at all. She thought about Elias Prout and his 2 visits and his careful, polite language about offering a fair price for the farm, and she lay in the dark thinking and did not sleep well. In the morning there was frost on everything and the barn was a black skeleton, the walls fallen in, the roof collapsed, 2 upright posts still standing at the corners like burned teeth. The ground around it was wet and blackened in a wide circle. August Rhodes was already at it when Lucy came out in the gray early morning, walking a grid pattern around the ruins in a methodical way that told her he'd been looking at it for some time already. He had his hat on and his coat buttoned, and he stood at the eastern edge of the ruins and looked at something on the ground. Lucy walked to him. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He pointed at the ground near the base of what had been the eastern wall. "Did you have anything stored here?" "Oil lie, anything like that." Lucy looked at the ground. She knew what she was looking at. She'd grown up on a farm. She'd seen what burn patterns looked like when something accelerated them. "No," she said, her voice coming out flat and quiet. "I kept the lamp oil inside near the kitchen door." August said nothing. He looked at the pattern of the burn again, looked at the ground around it. Then he looked at her, and there was a question in his face that was also a statement. "I have a neighbor," Lucy said carefully, "who is more interested in this property than I am in selling it. That the kind of neighbor who might get impatient. He's the kind of neighbor who works at the bank in town and doesn't do the things himself that he wants done." She looked at the ruins. "He's the kind of neighbor who might know people who would do things." August Rhodes looked at the ruins of her barn for a long moment. He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a serious accusation." "I didn't accuse anybody," Lucy said. "I just told you what kind of neighbor he is." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, the way she did everything that mattered. "You report this to the sheriff. Sheriff Dunmore in town is Elias Prout's brother-in-law," she said. "He came out last spring when one of my fence lines was cut and told me the wire likely failed on its own from weather." August turned and looked at the ruins again and was quiet for a moment. "You're out here alone." "I have been for 14 months. I noticed the cross south of the house." Lucy looked toward the small plot south of the yard, the wooden cross visible above the frost-stiff grass. "Thomas Townsend," it read, in the letters she'd carved herself because there was no one else to do it. "Born 1849, died October 1879. Beloved husband." She'd struggled with what to put after that. She'd settled on those 2 words because they were true and because the other things she'd wanted to say, the complicated things, the things that were tender and difficult and real, weren't the kinds of things that went on a cross. "My husband," she said. "He was thrown from a horse. Died 3 days after." She said it without looking at August. "I stayed because this is my land too, my work too. I helped build it." "I don't doubt it," August said, and the way he said it, quietly and without any particular surprise, made her look at him. They stood in the cold at the edge of the ruined barn and looked at it together for a moment. "I'll need to rebuild," she said. "Can't keep the horses in the feed shed all winter. And I had 4 sows in the barn. I don't know if they got out." She looked around the perimeter. "I don't see them." They found 3 of the sows in the brush at the edge of the north field, cold and unhappy, but alive. The 4th was not found, and Lucy didn't speak about it, just marked it the way she marked all losses now, with a brief close of the eyes and then forward. August stayed. He didn't announce it as a decision. He didn't make any kind of formal statement about it. He simply did not leave. He went back to the feed shed and saw to his horse and came back to the kitchen door and said, "You got tools. I can start pulling the useful lumber out of the ruins." Lucy looked at him for a moment. "I can pay you in meals and a dry place to sleep," she said. "That's about the shape of what I've got." "That'll do," he said. She gave him the tools from the small outbuilding where Thomas had kept them, and she went about her morning work, the milking and the feeding and the hauling of water from the well, and she could hear August moving in the ruins of the barn, the systematic sounds of salvage work. The days in that first week took on a rhythm that surprised her with how natural it felt. August was up before dawn every day and at work before she'd gotten the fire going in the kitchen. He ate what she cooked without complaint and with what seemed like genuine appreciation, which was a simple thing but not a small one. He spoke when there was something to say and did not fill silence with noise for its own sake. She learned things about him in pieces. He was from Indiana originally, a farm family, 4 brothers and a sister. He'd come west at 22 following the cattle drives because the farm hadn't been big enough for 5 sons and he was the second born and there'd been no place in it for him. He'd worked the drives for 2 seasons, then drifted into various kinds of work, fencing, freighting, a winter of line riding for a big outfit north of Dodge City. He'd never been married. He didn't say more than that about it and she didn't ask. He didn't talk about why he was drifting. She understood this too. Some reasons lived below the surface of a person and weren't available for conversation until they'd been thought through thoroughly enough to have edges that didn't cut when you touched them. Whatever August Rhodes was moving away from, he was still moving away from it. The salvageable lumber from the ruins was considerable. The barn had been Thomas's best building project, solid construction, and much of the framing had not burned through entirely. August sorted it with care, pulling nails and stacking boards of similar dimensions. He told her what they'd need to buy in town for the new construction, gave her a list written in a careful straight hand on the back of an old bill of lading she found in the kitchen drawer. "This is more than I can get from Pruitt's Bank," she said, looking at the numbers he'd written. "You have a different bank in town. There's Harmon Brothers on the main street. They're decent people." She paused. "It'll still be tight. Let's see what we can do with what's here first," August said. "I can cut timber from that stand at the northwest corner of your property if you'll permit it. That would save considerably on the lumber cost." She looked at him. "You know timber framing." "My father built 3 barns before I was 12, he said. "I watched every one of them. The timber cutting took the better part of a week, August working with the 2-man crosscut saw alone, which was brutal work and which he did without complaint. Lucy helped when she could, on the days when the farm's other demands allowed it, and she learned that he worked with a quiet, steady intensity that could go for hours without pause. He didn't push through exhaustion dramatically. He simply didn't stop when most men would have, and didn't make anything of it. The new barn frame went up on a Saturday in mid-November, and Lucy rode into Calico Flats the day before and asked around about help, and 6 men came out on Saturday morning. 3 of them neighbors and 3 of them men from town who'd known Thomas and who came, she thought, out of a mixture of respect for the dead and curiosity about the drifter she'd evidently taken on. The frame raising went well. The men were good workers and August was a natural leader of the work in a way that didn't announce itself. He simply knew the next step and moved to it, and the others followed without noticing they were following. By late afternoon, the main frame stood solid, the bent and braces square, the ridgepole in place. The men stayed for supper and Lucy cooked everything she had, a big pot of beans with salt pork, cornbread, and 3 dried apple pies, And the men ate in the yard in the cold and were loud and cheerful in the way that men are when they've done a day's hard and useful work together. Jim Holt, who was Lucy's nearest neighbor to the north and who had a wife named Mabel and 4 children under 10, came and stood beside her while she watched the men eating and said in a low voice, "That fella of yours knows what he's doing." "He's not my fella," Lucy said. "He's a man who happened to stop when the barn was burning." Jim Holt looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding not to say the thing he was thinking. "Well," he said, "he's a good worker. I'll say that." That night after the men had gone and the yard was quiet, Lucy and August sat on the back step of the farmhouse in the cold and looked at the skeleton of the new barn standing dark and angular against a sky full of winter stars. Their breath made small clouds. She had brought out 2 cups of coffee and given him one, and they sat close enough that the cold made the proximity feel practical and nothing more. "Thank you," she said, "for the frame, for staying to do it." "It's a good barn frame," he said. "The rest will come together quick. You sound like you intend to be here when it does." He looked at the stars for a moment. "If it suits you," he said, and the way he said it was careful, like a man laying something down gently. Lucy looked at the star-filled sky and thought about this. She thought about practical things, which was what she did when the other kinds of thoughts got too large. She needed the barn finished before the deep of winter. She needed a second pair of hands through the cold months, for the animals, for the maintenance of the farmhouse, for the dozen tasks that had been wearing her down since Thomas died. She needed all of these things practically and truly, but she was also aware, sitting next to August Rhodes in the November cold, that what she felt was not entirely practical, and that she was not certain what to do about that. "It suits me," she said. "For now." "For now," he agreed, and they sat a while longer in the cold before the temperature finally drove them in. The business with Elias Prout came to a head in the last week of November in a way that was more direct than Lucy had expected, and which August handled in a way she hadn't anticipated. Prout came out to the farm on a Thursday afternoon, arriving in a good buggy with a matched pair of bays, and a man riding alongside him that Lucy didn't recognize, a wide-shouldered man with a hat pulled low and an expression of deliberate blankness. Prout himself was perhaps 45, well-dressed for a man making a farm call, with a round face and small neat hands, and the particular manner of a man who believed that his reasonableness was self-evident, and who found resistance to it personally confusing. Lucy saw them coming from the kitchen window and stepped out onto the front porch to meet them, and August came around the side of the house from the barn work and stood at the corner of the porch, and she was aware of the slight shift in Prout's expression when he saw August standing there. "Mrs. Townsend," Prout said, climbing down from the buggy. "I heard about your misfortune with the barn. Terrible thing." "It was," Lucy said. "I thought it might be a good time to revisit our conversation about the property." "My position hasn't changed, Mr. Prout." Prout's smile stayed in place but became a slightly different kind of smile, the kind that acknowledges an obstacle. His eyes moved to August again briefly and with calculation. "I see you've taken on some help." "I have. Temporary arrangement, I'd imagine." He said this in the direction of August rather than Lucy, and it was the kind of thing said to make a man feel small, to remind him of his provisional nature. August said nothing. He was leaning against the corner post of the porch, and he was very still, the way he got when he was thinking, and he looked at Prout with a level attention that was not threatening exactly but was not nothing either. "Mr. Prout," Lucy said, pulling the man's attention back to her, "I've been thinking about the fire, about how it started." Prout's expression did not change. He was, she thought, a man who had practiced not letting his expression change. "These things happen," he said. "Old barns, dry autumn." "The burn pattern at the base of the eastern wall was unusual," August said from the porch corner, and his voice was conversational and quiet. "I've seen a lot of barn fires, worked enough farms to know what a natural fire looks like and what a set fire looks like." Prute looked at him with an expression that was now making less effort to be pleasant. "I don't believe I know you. August Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes, are you making an accusation?" "I'm describing a burn pattern," August said. "Mrs. Townsend is describing it to you. What you do with that information is your own affair." He paused. "I'd think carefully about what you do with it, though." There was a long moment of the kind of silence that has weight and temperature. The wide-shouldered man on horseback shifted slightly, and August's eyes moved to him for just a moment and then back to Prute, and that brief movement was very deliberate and not subtle at all. Prute smoothed the front of his coat with those small, neat hands. "I'll wish you good afternoon, Mrs. Townsend," he said, with great dignity, and climbed back into his buggy and drove out of the yard. Lucy watched the buggy go and then looked at August, who was watching it go too. "You think that'll hold him?" she said. For a while, he pushed off the corner post. "You should write down what you found in those burn patterns, date it, sign it, keep it somewhere, and write a letter to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, not to make a formal complaint necessarily, just to have a record that exists somewhere outside this county where Prute doesn't have connections." Lucy looked at him. "That's careful thinking." "I've been in enough places to know that careful thinking is usually worth more than the other kind," he said, and went back around the side of the house to the barn. She wrote the letter that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the good lamp lit, and she wrote it carefully and factually, and described the burn pattern and the prior incidents with the fence line and Prute's 2 visits regarding the property. She signed it Lucy Townsend, and she wrote the date, November 21, 1881, and sealed it and put it in the post the next time she went to town, and she kept a copy in the cedar chest in the hall under Thomas's old Sunday coat. Prute did not come back. The wide-shouldered man was never seen in the county again, as far as anyone could tell. Whether this was because of August's quiet words or the letter, or simply because Prute had decided the effort wasn't worth it, Lucy never knew for certain. But he didn't come back, and the bank sent another man when mortgage matters needed discussing, and that other man was merely a banker and nothing else. December came in hard and cold, and the barn progressed. August got the walls up and the roof planked and the tar paper tacked down before the first real snow, which came in the second week of December and covered everything in 6 inches of white silence. They got the stove into the barn on the morning of the snow, a small cast iron box stove that would keep the temperature manageable for the animals, and they sat on the straw bales in the new barn and listened to the snow come down outside with the stove beginning to tick and warm, and Lucy thought she had never felt anything quite like this particular kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of something being made whole again. "You're good at this," she said. "All of this. The building and the thinking and the handling of men like Prute." She paused. "What are you good at not?" The question surprised him. She could see that. He looked at her with that very still look, and then something shifted in it, became almost amused. "Staying in one place," he said. "Is that what you're not good at, or what you've just been doing?" He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about things that deserved seriousness. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore," he said. The snow outside was the hush and weight of December. The stove ticked. The horses moved in their stalls, comfortable sounds. Lucy pulled her coat tighter and looked at the new barn around her, the smell of green lumber and fresh straw, and she did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had not felt this particular quality of comfort in another person's presence in a very long time, perhaps ever. What she said was, "There's apple cake inside if you want some." He said he did. Christmas that year was quiet, as it had been the year before, and as it would have been again without intervention. Lucy had been bracing herself for it. The holiday without Thomas had been hard the previous year in a way she hadn't been prepared for, not the grief so much as the specific loneliness of a day designed around the idea of people gathered together. But Christmas in 1881 was different. Jim and Mabel Holt came over on Christmas Eve with their 4 children and a smoked ham and Mabel's dried cherry cake, and they ate and sang hymns around the parlor fire, and the children fell asleep in a pile on the settee. August had cut a small pine from the northwest stand, and set it up in the parlor corner, and decorated it with things that came to hand: strips of red cloth and dried orange peel, and a string of carved wooden beads that Lucy had had in the cedar chest since her own childhood in Ohio, brought west in a trunk and kept through everything, because they were the kind of thing you kept. Mabel Holt, who was a sharp and affectionate woman who observed things closely, watched August put the string of beads on the small pine tree at Lucy's direction, the two of them standing close together doing the unremarkable domestic task, and later in the kitchen while they washed the supper dishes Mabel said quietly to Lucy, "He looks at you like he's trying to memorize something." Lucy didn't answer right away. She washed a plate and set it to dry. "He's going to move on in the spring," she said. "He said so." "Men say things," Mabel said, in the tone of a woman who has been married to one for 9 years. "Men also mean things," Lucy said. "Sometimes they mean what they say." Mabel looked at her. "Do you want him to stay?" Lucy set another plate to dry. "I don't let myself want things I can't count on," she said. And then she heard how that sounded, heard the door she was putting between herself and the question, and she said, quieter, "I don't know, Mabel. I genuinely don't know." The Holts left in the early morning of Christmas. The children bundled into the wagon bed, and Lucy and August stood at the gate and watched the wagon go and waved and came back inside. And the house was very quiet in the way that houses are after company has filled them and left. August had gotten her something for Christmas. She hadn't known this and wasn't expecting it, and when he produced it from his saddlebag, it turned out to be a small brass compass in a leather case, not new, clearly well traveled, with scratches on the case and a needle that settled north with authority. He put it on the table between them without ceremony and said, "It was mine. I thought you might find a use for it, for the surveying work." Lucy had been doing her own surveying of the property, mapping the back acreage to have accurate documentation of the boundaries, because she'd learned that documented boundaries were one more protection against men like Prout. She'd been doing it with a handmade instrument, and it hadn't been going well. She picked up the compass and looked at it in her palm. It was a serious and useful thing, and it had belonged to him, and the fact that he'd given it to her was a more intimate gesture than he probably knew. "I have something for you," she said, and got up and went to the kitchen and came back with the book she'd wrapped in brown paper and set behind the bread box, a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Samuel Clemens, published in 1876, which she'd gotten in town at Gower's General Store when she'd gone in for the Christmas provisions. She hadn't been certain about it, whether it was the right thing, whether it presumed too much familiarity, but she'd gotten it anyway. August unwrapped it and held it and looked at the cover for a long time. "I haven't had a book to read in a long time," he said. "I used to read a great deal." He said this last part in a way that described something lost. "There are more in the parlor if you want them," she said. "Thomas had about 30, and I have another 20 from before we were married." He looked up at her. "You read a lot." "All the time," she said. "It was the one thing my mother insisted on. She said a woman who could read was a woman nobody could entirely contain." Something in August's face moved in a direction she couldn't name, but it was warm and she was aware of her own pulse. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was," Lucy said. "She died of a fever when I was 16, but she got me as far as she could first." They sat by the parlor fire and August began reading Tom Sawyer and Lucy read from her own book, and the hours went by in an uncomplicated peace that felt to Lucy like a gift she hadn't known to ask for. January brought the deep cold, the kind that cracked the wooden frames of the windows and made the ground ring like iron underfoot and froze the water in the pump solid before noon. They developed a system for the mornings, Lucy getting the kitchen fire going while August went to the barn and tended the animals and broke the ice in the water troughs. And then they ate breakfast together before the day split into its various tasks. The days were short, and the work was necessary but not relentless in the way of autumn, and there was time in the evenings for the fire and the books and the kinds of conversation that grow slowly over weeks and months of proximity, deepening gradually the way a river deepens as it runs. She learned about Indiana, about a farm with elm trees along the eastern fence, and a mother who made blackberry preserves every August and the year the creek flooded and took the lower pasture fence, and all 5 brothers had worked in the water for 2 days to pull it back. She learned that August had a quality of homesickness that he'd carried for years, but had kept moving so he didn't have to feel it directly. The way you move away from a fire that's too hot rather than moving toward it to put it out. He learned about Ohio, about her mother and her father who was a school teacher and the farm where she grew up which was small but decent, about how she'd met Thomas Townsend at a church social when she was 20 and married him at 21 and come west at 22 with a trunk and a compass and a conviction that she could make something good happen. You believed in him, August said one evening about Thomas. In what he was building. I believed in what we were building, she said. He was a good man. He wasn't easy, not always, and he didn't always know what to do with himself when things didn't go right, but he was a good man. She looked at the fire. I miss him still. Not the same way I did at first, but I miss him. That makes sense, August said, and she appreciated that he didn't say more than that he didn't try to resolve it or put it in a frame that made it neat. They were sitting on the settee, which had happened gradually over the weeks, them moving from opposite sides of the parlor to the same piece of furniture, a migration as natural and unremarked as 2 planets finding a shared orbit. The fire was low and the lamp was good and they were each reading, and August's arm was along the back of the settee and not quite around her but close to it, close enough that she was aware of it, and she thought about what Mabel Holt had said about the way he looked at her. She looked at him. He was reading the Tom Sawyer book on his knee, and he felt her look and turned his head and met her eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything and the fire ticked and the wind moved outside and the January dark was very complete. August, she said. Lucy, he said at the same time. They both stopped. He almost smiled and she did smile and it broke something loose in the room. You first, he said. I was going to say that I know you said you were moving on in the spring, she said, carefully and honestly, because she was a woman who had learned the hard way that careful honesty was the only kind worth using, and I'm not asking you not to. I'm just saying that I'll be sorry when you do, that's all. He was looking at her steadily. That very still look, but it was different now. There was something in it that was open in a way she hadn't seen before, something that had put down its guard. I've been trying to figure out, he said slowly, why I'm still here. Have you figured it out? He looked at her for a long moment and she held the look and didn't look away. I think so, he said. He reached over and took her hand from where it was resting on her own book, and his hand was warm and work-roughened, and it closed around hers with a care that was more eloquent than anything he could have said. They sat there with their hands together and the fire going down, and outside the January wind working at the corners of the farmhouse. And Lucy Townsend felt something she'd been holding tightly for 14 months beginning, slowly, carefully, to unclench. February was different. Not dramatically different, not with any declaration or ceremony, but different in the way that the same 2 people in the same house feel different when the thing that was unspoken has been spoken, or at least acknowledged in the way that matters most, in a held hand and a look that holds. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of February, standing in the kitchen where she was making bread, him having come in from the barn with cold hands and a dusting of snow on his shoulders. He didn't move toward her the way a man moves when he's made a plan about it. He moved toward her the way a person moves toward warmth, and she turned from the bread dough and he was there, and they were simply very close for a moment, and then he kissed her once gently and pulled back and looked at her, and the question in his face was the kind that matters. All right, he said. More than all right, she said. He smiled. It was not something he did easily or often, the full smile, but when it came it transformed his face in a way that made her chest do something complicated. They were careful with each other in those weeks, the way people are careful when they know that what they're handling is real, and that the handling of it matters. There was no rushing. The evenings by the fire, the reading side by side, the daily work done companionably, the conversations that went deeper with every week, these were the structure of it. And what grew within that structure grew in a way that felt solid and real rather than sudden and precarious. She told him about the loneliness. Not just since Thomas, but before. The particular loneliness of a person who has always been more thoughtful than the situations around her seemed to require, who had grown up with books, and with a mother who told her that she was capable of more than others might expect, and who had therefore always held a private life inside the visible one, a whole country of thoughts and feelings and observations that she'd never been able to fully share with anyone. He told her about being a second son, about being the one who didn't fit the structure of the thing his family had built, not because he wasn't capable but because there was no slot for him in it, and how that had translated into years of motion that he'd framed as freedom but which had begun to feel in these recent years more like the absence of a place than the presence of liberty. "You've been looking for something," she said. "I suppose I have been," he said. "I didn't know what it was until recently." She looked at him. "How recently?" "About the time a barn caught fire," he said, and the simplicity of it was so exact and true that she laughed, and he laughed with her, and it was the best sound the farmhouse had held in a long time. The snow melted in early March, the fields going from white to gray to the first tentative brown of thawed earth, and the light changed and the days stretched out, and the smell of the land coming back to itself after the winter was the most hopeful thing Lucy knew how to name. She walked the fields in the morning sometimes, checking the soil, planning the spring planting, and August walked with her when he could, and they talked about the crops and the barn and the farm, and it didn't feel like talking about practical things. It felt like talking about a future. One morning in mid-March, they were standing at the edge of the east field, which was the best field, good dark soil that drained well and caught the morning light. And Lucy was talking about the corn she'd plant there, and how Thomas had always said that field would produce twice what it did if it were managed differently. And she had been trying his ideas for it since he died, and the previous year it had indeed done considerably better. "That field could do with a second acre turned," August said, looking at the edge of the field where the grass had been let go. "If we broke it this spring, it'd be ready for a crop the year after." Lucy looked at the edge of the field. Then she looked at August. "You said we," she said. He looked at her, a beat. "I did," he said. "August. Lucy. Are you staying?" He looked at the field and then at the farmhouse and then at her, and the quality of his looking was different from the first night she'd seen it by the light of the burning barn. It was no longer contained and measuring. It was open and certain and warm. "If you'll have me," he said, "not as a hired hand, as something else." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with care, which was a thing she had learned to appreciate about him, that he chose words carefully, that he didn't say things he didn't mean. "I haven't been able to think about the spring in terms of leaving," he said. "For months now, when I think about the spring, I think about being here. That's new for me. I don't want to move through it. I want to stay in it." Lucy Townsend stood in the March morning at the edge of the east field on her land, her farm, the land she'd helped build and had stayed on when staying was hard, and she looked at August Rhodes and felt the truth of what she'd been feeling for months, fully and without reservation. "Ask me properly," she said, "and I'll tell you yes." He looked at her and something crossed his face that was almost surprised and then wasn't, and he stepped forward and took both her hands and looked at her in that direct and serious way and said, "Lucy Townsend, I'd like to stay. I'd like to make a life here with you if you'll permit it. I don't have much to offer except myself and whatever I'm capable of, and I know that's not a great deal given the circumstances. You went into my burning barn for my horses," she said. "I think I know what you're capable of." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a yes?" "That is very much a yes," she said, and he pulled her in and held her, and the March sun was on the back of her head, and the field smelled of cold earth and the beginnings of things. And she put her arms around him and held on, and thought that there were people in the world who found the thing they were looking for, and then there were people who had it arrive by firelight in the dark. and she was one of the latter, and she was grateful for it with every part of herself. They were married in the last week of April 1882 in the Methodist Church in Calico Flats, Reverend Aldous Hayes presiding. It was a simple ceremony, a Tuesday morning, the church small and plain with its whitewashed walls and its 4 rows of pews. Jim and Mabel Holt were there, Mabel crying openly and not apologizing for it. Old Gower from the general store came, having taken a liking to August over the winter when August had come in weekly for supplies, and had apparently had conversations about seed varieties and the novels of Sir Walter Scott that Gower still mentioned months later. The schoolteacher, Miss Clara Pennington, who boarded at the Holt farm and who had been friendly to Lucy through the hard winter months, was there, and 3 other women from town who had been quietly rooting for Lucy's welfare since Thomas died, and who regarded the arrival of August Rhodes as something providential. Lucy wore her good dress, blue wool with white cuffs, which Mabel had altered for her in the weeks before because the fit at the shoulders had never been quite right. August wore clean clothes, the best he had, and had cut his hair and shaved. And when Lucy came up the aisle on Jim Holt's arm, she looked at August standing at the front of the church, and he looked back at her, and it was as simple as that. 2 people who had found each other by accident and by fire and by months of slow and honest work, standing in a plain room and saying yes to it. They said the words clearly, both of them, without hesitation. The spring and then the summer were the hardest work of Lucy's life, and also the best of it. With August there, with his knowledge and his energy and his steady partnership, the farm began to operate at a different level. The East Field's expanded acre was broken and turned, and the original portion planted in corn, which came up strong and straight through the June heat. The garden behind the house was doubled in size, and Lucy planted it with a thoroughness she hadn't been able to manage alone, the beans and the squash and the tomatoes, and the root vegetables that would see them through another winter. August built a chicken house in May, a small tight structure that kept the 6 hens and the rooster comfortable through the summer storms, and the eggs were a daily pleasure and a tradable asset in town. He fixed the north fence line that had been cut the previous spring and had never been entirely right since, and he extended it to properly enclose the new pasture on the northwest where Dolers and Pepper and now a 3rd horse, a sturdy bay quarter horse August had bought at a reasonable price from a man in town, had more room to graze. The new barn, properly finished now, with the inside work done through the winter, whitewash on the interior walls and proper stall boards, and a hay storage loft that could hold enough to see the animals through even a hard winter, was a source of quiet pride for both of them. It was better than the barn that had burned. It was the barn they'd built together. In September, they drove into Calico Flats together for the first time since the wedding, and Lucy was aware of the town around her in a new way, not as a place she came to alone on necessary errands and escaped from as quickly as she could, but as a community she was part of, and the difference was August beside her on the wagon seat, not just because having a husband changed how a woman was perceived in 1882, though it did, but because having a partner changed the quality of everything. Elias Prout passed them on the main street and tipped his hat to Lucy and looked at August with the look of a man recalibrating a situation he'd thought was going his way, and then he kept walking, and that was the last significant attention he ever paid to Lucy Townsend or her farm. The corn harvest in October was the best the East Field had ever produced. August had been right about the soil. They brought it in together over 3 days, the kind of harvest work that is physical and complete and satisfying in its bones, and they sold the surplus to the grain dealer in town and paid off the remaining mortgage balance on the farm in full on a Thursday afternoon, Lucy handing over the money to the new bank man, Mr. Anders, who was a perfectly ordinary banker and nothing more. She walked out of the bank onto the main street of Calico Flats with August beside her and the receipt for the paid mortgage in her hand, and she stopped on the wooden sidewalk and looked at it and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since Thomas died. August stood beside her and looked at the receipt in her hand and then at her face. "All right," he said, in the same way he'd asked her that in the kitchen in February, in the same tone, the one that was asking the real question. "Better than all right," she said, in the same way she'd answered before. He took her hand on the sidewalk in the middle of Calico Flats Main Street, which was not a dramatic gesture but which was, in the context of 1882, and this town and this man and this woman, exactly the right one. They had supper at the hotel restaurant that evening, which they had never done before, and which felt like a celebration because it was. They sat at a table by the window and ate roast beef and good bread and a piece of apple pie each, and the lamp on the table between them was warm, and August looked at her across the table with the specific quality of attention he had, that steady open look that still occasionally surprised her with its completeness. "What are you thinking?" she asked, because he was looking at her with something particular in it. "I'm thinking about next year," he said. "About what we'll plant in the north section if we break it this winter, and about whether we should take on another pair of sows in the spring." He paused. "And I'm thinking about what your mother would have made of all this." Lucy looked at him. "What do you mean?" "A woman who could read so well nobody could contain her," he said. "She'd have been satisfied, I think." Lucy looked out the window at the main street of Calico Flats in the October evening, the lanterns lit, the horses at the rail, the ordinary life of a small western town going on in its ordinary way, and she thought about her mother in Ohio and the farm she'd grown up on, and the woman she'd been at 20 who had come west with a trunk and a conviction. "She'd have liked you," Lucy said. "She always liked honest men." "I'll take that," August said. Walking back to the wagon in the dark, their breath making clouds in the October cold, he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the main street of Calico Flats went about its business around them, and it was perfect in its simplicity. Lucy told him in November, in the same kitchen where he'd eaten her stew on the night of the fire a year before, sitting at the same table with the same lamp between them. She sat down across from him with 2 cups of coffee and set them down and folded her hands on the table and looked at him. He looked back, reading her face. "What is it?" "There's going to be a third person on this farm," she said. August was very still for a moment, in that way he had, and she watched him process it, and then what happened to his face was so unguarded and so completely and thoroughly joyful that she felt her own eyes fill. He reached across the table and took her hands. "When?" "June, I think." She was smiling at him and crying slightly at the same time, which was undignified and entirely beyond her control. He was on her side of the table quickly, pulling her up and holding her, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, and the kitchen was warm and the lamplight was gold, and outside the November dark was the same dark it had been a year ago when a barn was burning and a stranger came off the road, and there was nothing outside that darkness that could touch what was inside the light. "June," he said quietly into her hair. "June," she said. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was easier than the previous one in the ways that mattered most. They had the barn, complete and solid. They had the stores laid in, enough food and wood and lamp oil to see them through anything the territory could do. They had each other in a way that was settled now and deep, not new and tentative but known and sure, the intimacy of 2 people who have worked and talked and disagreed and come back together enough times that they know the shape of each other all the way through. They read together in the evening still and talked about what they read, and the conversations ranged across everything, farming and history and the territory and the question of what was fair and what was not. A question that the West in 1882 posed constantly. They talked about the changes coming, the railroad spreading west, the territories filling in, the old open range closing down as more settlers came and more fence wire went up, and August had opinions about all of it that were thoughtful and sometimes uncomfortable, and Lucy appreciated the discomfort, because it meant he was thinking honestly rather than conveniently. He talked once, on a January evening, about something she hadn't raised directly but had been aware of. The way the land that was now being divided and deeded and farmed had been used for thousands of years before any of this, and by whom, and what had happened to those people. There were Comanche bands still in the territory, fewer now than a decade before, the wars of the 1870s having pushed most of them onto the reservation at Fort Sill in Indian Territory. August had seen some of what had happened in his years of moving across the West, the displacement and the violence and the grinding official machinery of a policy that called itself civilization while doing things that were not. "I don't know what the right answer is," he said. "I know what happened was wrong in ways that words don't cover." He looked at the fire. "I know that sitting on this piece of land and calling it ours, that sits differently when I think about all of it." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've thought about it." She looked at him. "I don't know what to do with knowing it either. I just think knowing it is better than not knowing it, and maybe how you live after knowing it is what matters." He looked at her. "How do you live after knowing it?" "Honestly," she said, carefully, trying not to pretend that things are simpler than they are. He was quiet, and then he nodded, the single serious nod that meant he agreed with something important. "That's the best answer I've heard," he said. In March, when the snow was going and the fields were beginning to wake, they had their first real argument. It was about the North Field and whether to plant wheat or to leave it for grazing, and it was also about other things, about whose judgment was final and about the difference between partnering and deferring, and they both said things that were more pointed than they needed to be. Lucy went to bed that night in a cold silence and lay in the dark thinking about stubbornness and pride, and the way that caring about someone doesn't make you immune to their capacity to frustrate you entirely. August came to bed an hour later and lay in the dark beside her and said, "I was wrong about the wheat. It's your land and you know it better than I do, and I was making the argument from theory instead of from knowledge." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't entirely wrong about the wheat," she said. "The market price argument was sound." "The market price argument was sound," he allowed. "But the soil composition argument was yours, and it was better. So we plant wheat in the eastern third and leave the western two-thirds for grazing," she said. "That's the reasonable position," he said. "We could have gotten there 3 hours ago." "We could have," he agreed. She turned over in the dark and faced him. She could see the outline of his face, the familiar lines of him. "We're going to argue," she said. "We're going to argue as long as we're both people with opinions." "Yes," he said. "I don't mind arguing," she said. "I mind it when we're not honest with each other about why we're arguing." "I was protecting my ego," he said. "That's what the wheat argument was about at bottom." "I know," she said. "I was protecting my authority, which is the same thing." "We're both difficult," he said. "Very," she said. She reached over and found his hand in the dark, and he closed his fingers around hers. And that was the end of it. Not a resolution through words, but through the simple physical fact of choosing each other after choosing to be angry, which is what love actually does in practice. The baby came on a warm June morning with a thoroughness and speed that surprised everyone, including the midwife, a steady woman named Mrs. Prentice, who had delivered half the children in the county and who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. He came into the world at sunrise, which Lucy later said was entirely in keeping with his character as it developed. It was a boy. August held him for the first time with the June light coming through the bedroom window, the baby bundled in the white flannel that Mabel Holt had made and brought over the previous month. And the way August held him was so careful and so complete that Lucy, exhausted and wrung out and more happy than she had language for, watched from the bed and felt that the thing was fully real now. The life they had built, not just a farm and a deed and a good harvest, but a family. Something that would go forward past them and carry what they'd made. "Thomas," Lucy said. "I'd like to call him Thomas." She looked at August as she said it, holding his eyes. August looked at the baby. He looked at Lucy. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas August Rhodes," she smiled. Thomas August Rhodes, she agreed. Tom, as he was called from his first week, was from the beginning a person of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, and the summer of 1883 was the most sleep-deprived of either of his parents' lives and also the most extraordinary. He had August's dark hair and Lucy's gray eyes, and a frown that could have belonged to either of them, and which he deployed with regularity whenever the world failed to meet his standards, which was often. August was transformed by him, not into someone different, but into a more complete version of who he'd been. The contained and careful man becoming someone who could sit for an hour on the kitchen floor with a baby making sounds that neither of them could have predicted coming from a person of that size. He sang to Tom in the evenings, old songs from Indiana that Lucy had never heard, and she would stand in the doorway of the parlor and listen to August's voice in the low lamplight and feel the fullness of everything they'd made. The years that followed were full and good, and not without their difficulties, because real life in the territory was not without difficulties, but they were the difficulties of weather and hard seasons, and the ordinary negotiations of two people building something together, not the darkness of before. The farm grew. By 1885, the North Field was producing reliably, divided as they'd agreed into wheat and grazing. The chicken house had been replaced with a proper poultry barn that housed 30 hens. The kitchen garden had expanded to include an orchard plot, young apple and pear trees that wouldn't produce for several years, but which represented the confident thinking of people who were planning to be somewhere for a long time. Tom walked at 10 months and talked at 12 full sentences by 2, and was generally regarded by everyone who knew him as a child of formidable determination and surprising sweetness, which were his parents' qualities combined. He followed August everywhere with an attention that was half worship and half scientific inquiry, watching everything August did and asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted a less patient man. August answered every one of them seriously, treating his son's curiosity as the important thing it was. Lucy taught him to read at 4, the same age her mother had taught her, sitting at the kitchen table with the same patient care, starting with the letters and working up through words to the simple books she'd had from her own childhood and had kept in the cedar chest. When Tom read his first full sentence aloud, sitting at the kitchen table with his small face set in concentration, Lucy put her hand over her mouth and felt her eyes fill in the way that happens when something is both wonderful and final, when a thing you've given a person becomes irrevocably theirs. Jim Holt stopped by one afternoon in the summer of 1885 and found August and Tom repairing the east fence, Tom at 3 years old holding the staples in a small leather pouch with great seriousness while August worked the wire. Jim leaned on the fence and watched them for a while. "You know," Jim said to August, "when you rode in 3 years ago with your saddle bags and your drifter's coat, I thought you'd be gone by February." August considered this, using the fence stretcher methodically. "So did I," he said. Jim looked at Tom, who was now examining a beetle on the fence post with the full force of his scientific attention. "What changed?" August looked at his son and then in the direction of the farmhouse, though it wasn't visible from where they were. "I ran out of things I was moving away from," he said, "and started moving toward something instead." Jim Holt nodded slowly. "That'll do it," he said. In the spring of 1886, Lucy told August she was expecting again, at the same kitchen table with the same lamp between them, and this time he was around the table before she'd finished the sentence. The second child was a girl born in November, and they named her Clara, after Miss Pennington, the schoolteacher, who had been a steady friend to Lucy through the hard years, and who was deeply pleased by the honor and also somewhat flustered by it, being a private person, and who became the child's devoted unofficial aunt. Clara was entirely different from Tom, quieter and more watchful, with Lucy's dark hair and August's way of being very still when she was thinking. She observed the world with a particular intensity that suggested she was collecting information for purposes of her own, and she adored her brother with a fierceness that expressed itself in following him everywhere and hitting him when he annoyed her, which Tom bore with the philosophical tolerance of a person who had no choice. Mabel Holt, at Clara's christening, held the baby and looked at Lucy across the parlor full of neighbors and friends and said, "Do you remember what you told me about not wanting things you couldn't count on?" "I remember," Lucy said. "Look at all of this," Mabel said, meaning the room and the people in it and the baby in her arms and August across the room with Tom on his hip and the farm outside the windows. "I know," Lucy said. "I know." By 1888 the farm was producing at a level that Thomas Townsend, good man that he'd been, had only hoped for in his most optimistic projections. The east fields' expanded acreage yielded corn that put them solidly in profit. The north section's wheat was among the best in the county. The livestock operation had grown to include 12 sows, a small beef herd of 8 animals, and the poultry operation that kept Lucy in egg revenue through the off-season months. They employed 2 men part-time during the busy seasons, neighbors' sons who were glad of the work, and the farm's reputation as a well-run and fair operation meant they were never short of help when they needed it. August never talked about drifting anymore. It had been so thoroughly replaced by something else that the years of motion before felt to him sometimes like they'd happened to a different person. A younger person who'd been carrying a weight he hadn't known was a weight until he'd set it down. He had set it down in this place, on this land, with this woman and the family they'd made together, and he knew it with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has found his ground and stands on it completely. One evening in September of 1888, with Tom at 5 years old asleep upstairs and Clara at 2 asleep in her crib and the harvest in and the accounts balanced, and the farm quiet around them, Lucy and August sat on the back step of the farmhouse the way they had on that November night years before, looking at the barn that stood where the burned one had been, solid and whitewashed in the September dark. The sky was full of stars. "Do you ever think about Indiana?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "in the way you think about somewhere you're from, not with wanting to go back, just with knowing it's there. Do you ever regret not going back to see your family?" He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote to my mother 2 years ago," he said, "and she wrote back. The farm is run by my brother Daniel now and the others have spread out. She's well." He looked at the stars. "She said she was glad I'd found a place. I didn't know you wrote to her. I should have told you." He looked at her. "I was ashamed of how long it had taken me to do it." "We all take too long to do some things," she said. "The important thing is that you did it." He looked at the stars again. "Like to meet you," he said. "And the children. I thought perhaps next year when the children are a bit older and travel is easier we might take the train east." Lucy looked at him. The trip east had been a thing she'd thought about abstractly, the idea of introducing August to whatever remained of her own family in Ohio, a pair of aunts and cousins she'd been out of touch with, people who had known her mother and father. "I think we should," she said. "Both places, Indiana and Ohio." "A circuit," he said. "A circuit," she agreed. They sat a while in the September night and looked at the barn and the dark land and the stars, and the sound of the farm around them was the sound of alive and cared for things, horses in the barn and hens in the poultry house and the smell of the turned earth getting ready for winter and the big October sky overhead getting ready for another season. "August," she said. "Lucy, I want to tell you something." "Tell me." She looked at the barn, at the whitewashed walls catching starlight. "The night this place was burning," she said, "I thought it was the end of something. The barn was going and I was alone and I'd been alone for a long time and I thought this is the thing that breaks it, that breaks the whole arrangement." She paused. "And then there was a man on a roan horse who turned off the road when he didn't have to and everything changed. Not quickly, not in a moment, but from that moment." August was quiet and listening, the way he listened to things that mattered. "I don't think about the fire as a terrible thing anymore," she said. "I know that sounds strange. But I think about it as the night everything changed, and I'm glad it happened." She looked at him. "I'm glad you were on that road." He looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, in the way he'd looked at her for years now, that open and direct and warm look, the look that was entirely his and that she had become so thoroughly accustomed to that the idea of not having it was inconceivable. "I don't know what I was looking for when I turned off that road," he said. "I saw the fire and a woman running toward it and I turned off the road. That's the whole of what I knew about it at the time." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know I was looking for exactly this," he said. "I just didn't know enough to call it by name." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the back step of their farmhouse in the September dark on their land, with their children sleeping inside, and their animals settled, and their life around them complete and real and continuing forward. The stars moved overhead the way stars move, in the slow arc of a world that keeps turning regardless of the small human fires below, the burning ones and the warm ones, the ones that destroy and the ones that build. In the territory in 1888, on a farm in a county that had once tried to take it from her and had failed, on the ground that was hers and his and theirs, and would someday be Tom's and Clara's, Lucy Townsend and August Rhodes sat together in the night, and were simply, fully, completely where they belonged. In the spring of 1889 they made the trip east. They went by train from Calico Flats to Kansas City, and then north to Indiana, the children wide-eyed and pressed against the train windows the whole way, Tom narrating everything they passed in a running commentary that delighted the other passengers and occasionally startled them. Clara sat in Lucy's lap and watched everything with those serious gray eyes, filing it all away in her private interior accounting of the world. Indiana was green in a way that the territory was not, the particular deep saturated green of the Midwest in May. And August was very quiet when they came into the county where he'd grown up, looking out the window with an expression that Lucy watched carefully. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something more layered, the complicated feeling of returning to a place that shaped you after you've been shaped by other places too, of seeing yourself in context of where you came from. August's mother was 71 years old and entirely herself, a small, upright woman with sharp, dark eyes and the same quality of stillness in her face that her second son had. And when she came out onto the porch of the old farmhouse and saw August coming up the path with Lucy beside him, and a boy of 5 and a girl of 2, she stood there for a moment and pressed her hand to her mouth, and then came down the steps at a rate that defied her years. She hugged August for a long time and didn't say anything at all, which was, Lucy thought, exactly right. Then she pulled back and looked at him with those sharp eyes and said, "You look like yourself again. You look the way you looked before you left, when you still knew what you were worth." August looked at his mother, and something moved through his face that was old and unguarded. "I found my way back to it," he said. His mother turned to Lucy with an attention that was total and unhurried, the attention of a woman who has been waiting a long time to take the measure of a person. Lucy met her eyes and stood still and let herself be looked at. "He wrote to me about you," August's mother said. "He wrote that you were the most capable and honest woman he'd ever met." "He's biased," Lucy said. "He's never been biased about anything in his life," August's mother said. "That's always been his problem." She took Lucy's hands in both of hers. "Welcome to the family, my dear. You've been in it for several years already, but I'm glad to say it to your face." They stayed 5 days in Indiana. They visited the farm, walked the land, saw the elm trees along the eastern fence and the creek and the fields that Daniel ran now, all of it smaller than August had remembered it and also somehow more itself than the memory. Tom was presented to aunts and uncles and cousins, and took to all of it with his characteristic enthusiasm, and Clara was passed around the family with the solemnity of something precious, which is what she was. Ohio was 6 days after Indiana, the aunts and cousins in a small town outside Columbus, and Lucy's reception there had a quality of completion about it, a coming back to the source of herself, the place where her mother had walked and her father had taught, and she had become who she was before she became who she'd chosen to be. She stood in the churchyard where her parents were buried on a May afternoon, Tom's hand in one hand and August's hand in the other, and she felt the whole of her life present at once, the Ohio girl and the Missouri bride and the Kansas widow and the woman she was now, and all of it was one continuous thing. She saw that clearly, one long act of making something of herself that her mother had started, and that she had continued, and that would go on through Tom and Clara, and whatever came after. August stood beside her in the churchyard, and held her hand, and was very quiet and present, and asked no questions and made no comments. Just let her be there as long as she needed to be, which was a kind of love she had learned to recognize and value above almost any other kind. They came back to the farm in June on the evening of Tom's 6th birthday, arriving on the evening train and hiring a wagon in town and driving out in the summer dusk. And when the farm came into view from the road, the whitewashed barn and the farmhouse with the lamp in the kitchen window left burning by Gower's son who'd been watching the place, August pulled the wagon to a stop for a moment. The same place on the road where a roan horse had stopped one October night 7 years before, when the sky to the east was burning orange and a woman was running toward the fire. The view's improved, Lucy said. August looked at the farm, at the barn standing solid and lit in the evening light, at the house with the yellow lamp glow in the kitchen window. He looked at it for a long moment. Considerably, he said. Tom had fallen asleep against Lucy's side, and Clara was asleep in August's lap, and the evening air smelled of June grass and the particular sweetness of the territory in summer, and a whippoorwill was calling from the north field in the diminishing light. August clicked the horse forward, and they drove down the road toward their farm, toward the house and the barn and the fields and the life they'd built out of an accident of fire and a man who'd turned off the road when he hadn't had to. And the evening settled around them warm and complete, and entirely, unambiguously, theirs. They pulled into the yard, and August helped Tom and Clara down, and Lucy unlocked the kitchen door and went in and lit the stove while August unhitched and stabled the horse. And Tom woke up enough to ask for birthday cake, and there wasn't any, and he accepted the promise of one tomorrow, with the dignity of a 6-year-old who has learned that some things are worth waiting for. They ate the cold supper that had been left for them by Gower's son, cold roast chicken and bread, and the jar of pickled cucumbers Lucy had put up before they left in April, and they ate it at the kitchen table by the lamplight, and it was the best meal either of them had eaten in the 2 weeks of travel, because it was theirs, the kitchen was theirs, the light was theirs. The sound of the farm settling into its summer night around them was entirely and completely theirs. Later, with the children asleep upstairs and the lamp low and the farm quiet, they sat in the parlor in the familiar arrangement of years, side by side on the settee, the fire in June not for heat but for the pleasure of it, for the light. "We should plant the peach tree," Lucy said. "The one I brought the cutting for from Ohio. The ground will be warm now." "Tomorrow," August said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She was reading, her book open on her knee. He was reading too. Outside, the June night was full of cricket sound and the distant sound of the horses in the barn, and the deep peace of a summer night on a working farm where everything is in order and the people in the house have done their work well. The peach tree went in the next morning, in the orchard plot south of the house, alongside the young apple and pear trees. Tom helped dig the hole, asking questions the entire time about how trees grew and how long it would take, and whether the peaches would be good. And August answered every question seriously, while Lucy planted the cutting in the dark earth and pressed the soil around it with careful hands. When it was done, Tom looked at the small cutting standing in the turned earth and said, "How long until it grows big?" "A few years," August said. "That's a long time," Tom said. "Some things take time," Lucy said, "but they're worth the waiting." Tom considered this with the serious face of a 6-year-old philosopher. Then he nodded once, acceptingly, and ran off toward the barn to look at something that had captured his attention, and August and Lucy stood together by the small peach tree cutting in the warm June morning and looked at it and then at each other. The farm was alive around them. The east field stood in corn already knee-high and climbing. The north field's wheat was turning gold at the edges. The chickens moved in their runs. The sows lounged in the morning sun. Tom's voice came back to them from the barn, asking Pepper the horse a question that Pepper was apparently declining to answer. 8 years since a barn burned. 8 years since a drifter turned off the road. 8 years of building and learning and arguing and making up and growing things and raising children and becoming, through work and honesty and the daily choice of each other, something that neither of them could have imagined or planned or predicted. August put his arm around Lucy's shoulders and she leaned into him. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about the back acreage." "Tell me," she said. And he did, and she listened, and they walked back to the farmhouse together in the June morning, talking about the land, talking about what they would make of it, talking about the future with the ease of people who know exactly where they are standing and intend to go on standing there together for a very long time. The peach tree grew. In 3 years it was taller than Tom, who was very proud of this for one season before he outgrew it, and then impressed by it for a different reason. In 5 years it bore fruit for the first time, small and uneven peaches that were nonetheless the sweetest thing Lucy had tasted since Ohio. She made preserves from them in the kitchen in August while August and the children watched, and she put them up in the glass jars in neat rows on the kitchen shelf, and they ate them through the winter with the quiet pleasure of something that has come fully into what it was always going to be. Clara, at 10 years old, asked her mother how long the tree had been growing. "Since before you could walk," Lucy said. "We planted it the summer after we came back from Indiana and Ohio. The summer after your father and I went back to the places we came from and found we were glad to come home." "Where is home?" Clara asked, in the philosophical way she had, the way of a child who is genuinely asking and not performing the question. Lucy looked out the kitchen window at the farm in the October light, the fields resting after the harvest, the barn solid and white, the orchard where the peach and apple and pear trees grew, the south plot where the cross for Thomas Townsend stood in its quiet dignity, the north fence line running straight and sound to the horizon. "This is home," she said. "This exact place." Clara looked out the window too, seriously taking inventory. Then she looked at her mother. "Good," she said, with the finality of a person who has confirmed something important, and went back to her book. Lucy laughed, quietly and entirely, and the kitchen smelled of peach preserves cooling in their jars, and the October light was the gold and particular light of harvest season in the territory. And somewhere outside August's voice came to her from across the yard, talking to Tom about something, and Tom answered and then laughed. And the sound of it came through the kitchen window like something given, like something that had been earned. Like something that had started on a burning October night and found its way, through all the seasons and all the work and all the honest choosing, to exactly this. A kitchen in October, a peach tree in the yard, a family on their land, and the long, sweet, ordinary future stretching out ahead of them. All the way to spring and past it and on.